Welcome, guys, to the penultimate episode of your video lectures this year. I get the Nixon-Carter years domestic policy, and yes, I am the only APUSH teacher that was alive during this time period. All right, a major change here, guys. Very important for you guys to know this, and that is new federalism. All right, the debate of states' rights versus the federal government is back. Under the New Deal and the Great Society, the federal government had seriously increased its amount of money that was given, dictating to the states that they needed to use it for things like education and healthcare. Nixon changed that fundamentally by putting this money together in what's something called block grants. Remember that. It's a great piece of information. And these block grants allowed states to choose how they wanted to use the federal money. So whereas a state like Illinois might use that federal money for education, which is why we have such a great education system, southern states might not. They might choose to use that money for other things. And that's why today across the United States, you see such an uneven metric in terms of education, healthcare, prison reform, etc. This is a huge debate still today, and this is a major change after 100 years after the Civil War, when the primacy of the federal government had been determined. Now you see the rise again of state power and whether or not they listen to the federal government on all things. All right. The economics of the 1970s was the dominant topic. The economics we live in today, even though obviously there's struggles today with the pandemic, and we had a horrible event in 2008, the 1970s was one of the worst decades, or was the worst decade in economics since World War II. Under Nixon, they had something called stagflation, which is something they've tried to avoid since, where usually inflation goes up when the economy is hot. For example, the economy is going to get very powerful again after the pandemic, and inflation will probably go up. The key is trying to control how much it goes up. However, in the 1970s, inflation was going up, but economic growth was going down. There was a stagnant economy, and this had never happened before in the United States, and definitely not after post-World War II. And so the GDP declines were very bad, and yet prices were going up. People were making less, and prices were going up, and this is a stagflation economy. Nixon tried to shock the system by freezing wages and prices. Remember, this had been done under the New Deal, under the program of the NRA, but he just did it for a brief 90-day period to try to stop inflation in its tracks. He also decoupled us from the post-World War II gold standard. And this had a huge impact on productivity, driving productivity up tremendously in this country, but not real wages. So this seriously benefited businesses by this decoupling. And we're 50 years since, and people are still debating what the outcome of decoupling has been since 1972. All right, another major thing for Nixon. Nixon's a very important person in terms of changes during this time period, guys, and that is the complete final flip of the electoral map. As you guys know, since the Civil War through the 1960s, the South had voted solidly for the Democrats because Lincoln was a Republican. The North had, generally speaking, voted solidly for Republicans. However, this started changing during the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt swept the country, both North and South. The North fundamentally started changing more towards the Democratic Party with big urban cities. And after a very close election in 1968, where a third-party segregationist candidate by the name of George Wallace took 5 states, Nixon played up to that. He called these people the silent majority. He took advantage of, from last week, the Sun Belt migration. And he basically took advantage of people that were unhappy with desegregation. And he began flipping the South. And as you can see in 1972, he swept the entire country. But what it led to is today, where since the 1990s, basically the South and the West have been solidly Republican, and the far West and the North have been solidly Democratic. And this is pretty much been every election since 1992. So again, the New Deal flips the North from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and then Nixon completes the flip with his election in 1972. A good key there, again, is the silent majority. All right, another thing is the court changed dramatically after the Warren Court, which was seen as a very liberal court. Nixon appoints a number of new Supreme Court justices during his term. But even though the Burger Court was considered to be more conservative, judges tend to have independence, which is why it's important that we have an independent judiciary. And two cases that Nixon was very disappointed. One was Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is the most disruptive Supreme Court decision in the last 50 years. It has major political implications. It has a major implication on the way people vote. And so it's a very important case. And Nixon was very upset in United States versus Nixon when the Supreme Court did not give him executive privilege over the Watergate tapes, which would ultimately lead to his resignation. One of the really positive things that Nixon did, and people are often surprised, is on the heels of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring and is considered to be the mother of the modern environmental movement. Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, which is charged with making sure that the United States has clean air and water. And during his time period, Earth Day started in 1970, the very first Earth Day, as you can see there. And Earth Day has been celebrated every day since then. And the Environmental Protection Agency is still very important in keeping the waterways and airways of the United States clean today. In talking about clean air, oil, because of American support for Israel in the 1973 war, the Arab states got together, and a new rising power in the world, OPEC, we talked about them last week, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and put an embargo on the United States. I lived through this. I sat in some of those lines with my parents where people had to line up for gas. You can see that sometimes gas was completely out and you could not get gas, or they limited the amount. The speed limit around the country was also lowered to 55 and stood there for about 20 years because at a lower speed limit, you use less gas, and they were trying to save every penny that they could at that time. Finally, the one thing that Nixon will be always known for is Watergate. He is in a place of his own in terms of history. He had a number of different scandals after the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers. Nixon created an organization known as the White House Plumbers. They were supposed to clean up all the leaks in the White House. That's where they got their nickname. But they also went personally after people like Daniel Ellstrom, who published the Pentagon Papers, and tried to destroy their careers. The problem with this is everything that Nixon did, many of this was illegal. For some reason, he taped all of his conversations in the White House because he was incredibly paranoid. When it became obvious that these tapes were out there, that's when people went after the tapes, and the Supreme Court said that he had to give up those tapes, which he did, and those tapes were incredibly incriminating. He would have been impeached, and he probably would have been found guilty because even the Republicans in Congress told him this. And instead of going through the impeachment process, he resigned. He's the only president to resign from office in U.S. history. By the way, the organization that had started this was called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, which was probably not the best name that they could have come up with it for today. And so his vice president, Gerald Ford, who had not been elected to office because his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned, became president. Gerald Ford is the only president of the United States to never be elected by the American people at any level. And that led to the Ford presidency. All you need to know about the Ford presidency is inflation is still a problem. His only program during his time period was whip inflation now. His biggest mistake that all historians look at is he immediately pardoned Nixon, who resigned, pardoned him of all crimes, and this pretty much ensured that there was no way Ford was going to win re-election, which he did not. And the horror that was Vietnam finally ended under Ford, and Ford had to watch live on TV as the last members of the embassy were flown out of the American embassy in 1975, and the United States lost in Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese took over the entire country. And then finally, that's the president of Jimmy Carter. His entire presidency was mostly tied up with diplomatic affairs, but on the domestic front, once again, inflation, inflation, inflation. That was the problem of the 1970s. The Federal Reserve Chairman at that time, a man by the name of Paul Volcker, if you can remember that, is the one that was finally credited with whipping inflation. We have not had a serious problem, knock on wood, with inflation since about 1981, and Volcker is credited with doing that. There's a great cartoon showing how the problem of inflation was seen, and you could see it even made Time magazine cover articles. And this was the main thing that Carter had to deal with during what many people called the melees of the late 70s during this time frame. All right, so that's it for this week, guys. I hope you enjoy it, and looking forward to the last one next week. Take care.